Alice McKenzie was the 8th victim in the Whitechapel murder file, but is seldom included in modern lists of victims attributed to the serial killer known to history as Jack the Ripper, even though she's one of the few of the Whitechapel murder victims to be actually murdered within the parish of Whitechapel. It was also common at the time for her to be referred to in the press as the 8th victim of the Whitechapel murderer. That, viewers, is something of a dichotomy. In this episode, I'll examine this particular murder, and you can decide whether or not you think Alice McKenzie should be included as a victim of Jack the Ripper. And of course, at the end, I'll provide you with my solution to this particular case. Alice McKenzie was born Alice Pitts on the 8th of March 1845. Her family lived in the precincts of Peterborough Cathedral, which wasn't a bad start in life. She seems to have had 8 siblings. By 1861, Alice had gone into service and was living in Leicester. In 1863, she married Joseph Kinsey, and they had one child, also called Joseph, who died a few months after his birth in 1866 from a form of malnutrition. Her husband died the year after. By 1869, Alice had gravitated to London and started calling herself Mackenzie, which seems to be a corruption of her married name, Kinsey. There, like many in her circumstance, she seems to have fallen into an itinerant lifestyle, picking up various minor convictions, usually revolving around alcohol, and doing various small menial jobs such as cleaning. By the summer of 1882 or 1883, she was living off and on with an Irishman called John McCormack, often at Tenpenny's lodging house, a large establishment at 52 Gun Street, Spitalfields. This building here seems to have been part of it, and it still exists. She was known to smoke a pipe, which led to her nickname Claypipe Alice. McCormack worked as a porter for some Jewish tailors and had been a soldier. McCormack thought that Alice had not a friend in this city, but he believed she had a son, probably in America. Before he had become acquainted with her, she lived with a blind man who played a concertina in the streets for a living. He had often heard her say she was the last of her family, and had often heard her speak of her father, who was a postman in Liverpool. So it seems that Alice had provided McCormack with a fictitious backstory. At about 4 p.m. on Tuesday the 16th of July 1889, McCormack came back from work to this place here. He gave Alice the rent money and a bit on top so she could buy some things. He admitted they had an argument before he went to bed, and Alice went out. Alice was seen hanging around the immediate area, and at around 7:10 p.m, Alice took a blind boy called George Dixon to the Royal Cambridge Tavern on Commercial Street. Dixon claimed that he heard Alice speak to a man asking him to buy her a drink, to which the man replied yes. After drinking a pint of stout and mild, Alice took the boy back to Tenpenny's, where he also lived, and she told another resident that she was going back to meet a man from Tottenham, while poor John McCormack was in his slumbers. At about 8:30 p.m, Alice indeed went back out. At about 11 p.m, McCormack woke up and asked Mrs. Ryder, who ran the lodging house, whether Alice had paid the rent. She hadn't. Annoyed by this, McCormack went back to bed, as he had to get up early the next morning for work. Between 11:30 and midnight, 3 women who knew Alice saw her near the junction of Flower and Dean Street and Brick Lane, hurrying towards Whitechapel. In response to a question as to how she was doing, Alice replied,
"All right, I can't stop now."
It's now the early hours of Wednesday, the 17th of July, 1889. At 12:15 a.m, while on his beat, Police Constable Joseph Allen of H Division of the Metropolitan Police entered Castle Alley from Whitechapel High Street and paused to eat his supper under a gas lamp outside the Whitechapel baths and wash houses on Castle Alley. This is the only building, or the fascia anyway, that still survives on what is now called Old Castle Street. This stretch of Whitechapel High Street played host to the Whitechapel Haymarket. The entranceway to Castle Alley was through a narrow archway under some shops, similar to how you access Gunthorpe Street. Gunthorpe Street used to be called George Yard. It was where Martha Taborn was murdered in August 1888. Castle Alley was ill-lit and side passages led east to a network of other narrow courts, Newcastle Street and Newcastle Place, all of which joined together up here to form Old Castle Street, which then entered Wentworth Street, which you can see running across the top, which is also known as Petticoat Lane Market. And that, because of that, this road was very cluttered with stalls, costermonger barrows, carts and vans. It was one street east of Goldston Street, which is just over there, where a piece of Catherine Eddowes' bloody apron had been left on the 30th of September 1888 under that famous graffiti that read, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." At about 12:25 a.m, Sarah Smith, who worked in the wash house, went to bed but stayed up to read. Her room overlooked that gas lamp. I imagine her window may have been this one right here, because the gas lamp was pretty much where the two buildings joined. She heard nothing suspicious. After eating his supper, P.C. Allen left via Wentworth Street, where at about 12:30 he bumped into another beat policeman, P.C. Walter Andrews. They had a quick chat and Andrews proceeded down Castle Alley, which he then passed through without seeing anyone, while Allen went towards Commercial Street in that direction. At 12:45 it began to rain. A few minutes later, Sergeant Badham, who was in charge of the police beats in this area, met P.C. Andrews, who had returned to where Castle Alley merged into Old Castle Street, which is roughly here. They exchanged a few words and parted. At about 12:50 a.m, P.C. Andrews continued his patrol up the west side of Castle Alley, checking doors to make sure they are locked. In the darkness of the shadows caused by a couple of parked vans, barely illuminated by that same gas lamp which stood around here, he saw a body of a woman lying on the pavement. Initially, he thought that she was the worse for drink, or one of many outcasts who nightly frequent the alley to seek a shelter. On turning his light down, he was horrified to find a woman lying on her back with a terrible gash in her throat. There are stark similarities to how P.C. Neal discovered the body of Polly Nichols the previous year in Bucks Row. She was just 2 feet from the base of the lamppost and almost under one of the wagons. Her head was angled towards the curb, facing towards Whitechapel High Street, and her feet towards the wall. Blood flowed freely from 2 stabs on the left side of her neck and was pooling on the pavement. Her skirts had been lifted up to her waist, leaving on display the mutilated, bloody abdomen. On making this alarming discovery, P.C. Andrews heard footsteps. It was a young man called Isaac Jacobs, who lived in 12 Newcastle Place, just behind here, walking down the road with a plate in his hand. A strange sight perhaps, but Jacobs was on his way to Jack McCarthy's store on Dorset Street to get something to eat for his supper. McCarthy was the landlord of Mary Kelly, who was murdered by Jack the Ripper the previous November. It is indeed a small world. Andrews went after Jacobs down this way and asked him to stand with the woman while he called for assistance. Andrews then started blowing his whistle, which was what first alerted Sarah Smith as to what was happening below. She was still reading. The first officer to respond was Sergeant Badham, who had only got about 150 yards away when he heard the whistle. He joined Andrews and then gathered more constables, and messengers were sent to alert his superior officers and the doctor. At 1:05, Detective Inspector Edmund Reed was called out of his bed and he ran to the scene. He was in charge of H Division's Criminal Investigation Department and had personally led the inquiries into several of the previous Whitechapel murders. He noticed that blood was still flowing into the gutter. He felt the face and body and they were warm. There was no arterial spray. A couple of minutes later, the H Division police surgeon, Dr. George Bagster Phillips, arrived. He noted that the blood was starting to clot. Phillips pronounced life extinct. The body was placed on an ambulance, which is a hand cart, and was taken by Sergeant Badham to the mortuary belonging to the Whitechapel workhouse off Old Montague Street here, the same mortuary that had already played morbid host to the bodies of Martha Tabram, Polly Nichols and Annie Chapman. The pavement beneath the body was dry, meaning that she must have died before it started raining at 12:45 a.m, but after PC Andrews had left the spot at about 12:30 a.m. When the body was lifted, it also revealed a bloody broken clay pipe. Reed also found a bloody bronze farthing. She was wearing odd stockings and her clothes were patched. There are difficulties reconstructing the timeline. PC Allen said he passed through Castle Alley at 12:20 a.m. and spent 5 minutes eating. Then he left at 12:30 a.m. and met PC Andrews up on Wentworth Street. A little later at 12:55 a.m. he met Sergeant Badham on Commercial Street, who told him about the murder. He had a watch to gauge this by. PC Andrews said he was at Castle Alley between 12:20 and 12:25, 2 or 3 minutes after seeing PC Allen up on Wentworth Street. But by PC Allen's timing, PC Andrews would have been in Castle Alley at 12:35 at the earliest. Andrews continued on his beat and met Sergeant Badham at 12:50 on the corner of Castle Alley and Old Castle Street, just up there. He then patrolled down here and found the body, blew his whistle, and Badham returned 3 minutes later. This must have been after 12:55 a.m. Clearly, PC Allen could not have met Sergeant Badham at 12:55 up on Commercial Street if Sergeant Badham was at Castle Alley at 12:55 a.m. There must have been a 10 to 15 minute discrepancy between the timings of PC's Allen and Andrews. In this case, it's not of great importance, but it perfectly illustrates that police timings cannot be relied upon. I say this because when discussing the murder of Polly Nichols at Bucks Row, some people do totally rely on the timings of 3 constables who are involved in the discovery of the body. Anyway, all the top brass turned up for this one. Superintendent Thomas Arnold, who is in overall charge of H Division of the Metropolitan Police, and the Chief Constable of the Metropolitan Police, Lieutenant Colonel Bolton Monsell. At around 3 a.m, the top dog arrived, the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police himself, James Munro, highlighting the importance the police put on this case, which was obviously immediately suspected of being another Jack the Ripper murder. Munro took the matter very seriously and immediately authorised the deployment of 2 sergeants and 20 constables for special duty in Whitechapel for 2 months. In another report to the Home Office, dated the 26th of July 1889, Munro revealed that 3 sergeants and 39 constables were on special plain clothes duty in Whitechapel, and that they were to be given an enhanced rate of pay due to the unpleasant nature of their work. Clearly, Munro did not regard this as an ordinary murder. The initial focus was on the many common lodging houses which were in the immediate neighbourhood and coffee shops. This resulted in 2 people being briefly detained until their stories were checked out. One, John Larkin Mills, was detained at 2:35 a.m. and released at 4:30 a.m. as after inquiry was made, his statement was found satisfactory. The other person who was temporarily arrested was Isaac Jacobs. People who came under investigation tended to be mentioned by name, as we'll see again shortly. The residents at the wash house were also questioned, but all they knew was that the victim may have used their washing facilities on occasion under the name Kelly, which seems to have been a common label of convenience for the local unfortunates. The first task of any investigation was to identify the body. The following description was circulated in the newspapers. The victim of the murder was about 45 years of age and was about 4 foot 4 inches in height. She had brown hair and eyes and a fair complexion. She is believed to have been of the unfortunate class and has not yet been identified. She wore a red staff bodice patched under the arm and a brown staff skirt. She also had on a linsey petticoat, black stockings, buttoned boots and a paisley shawl, but no hat or bonnet. One peculiarity in the description may serve for purposes of identification. Part of the nail on the thumb of the left hand is deficient. Soon, John McCormack came forward and recognised the victim as being Alice McKenzie. He stated, "They did not know whether the deceased had been married and that the reason of her going out last night was that they had had a slight quarrel and that she had never, to his knowledge, been out late at night previously." He also saw the clay pipe and identified it as belonging to her. McCormack confirmed that he hadn't seen her after she went out at about 4 p.m. the previous day. Mrs. Ryder confirmed that she often went out at night while McCormack was asleep, and Mrs. Ryder also provided an alibi for McCormack on that night, that he was asleep in bed. She said that she didn't know whether or not Alice was a prostitute, but added the strange detail, although the police looked upon her as such, she was much addicted to drink. Mrs. Ryder seems to know that the police regarded Alice as a prostitute. It's not surprising that Mrs. Ryder and indeed the other lodging house keepers in the previous cases would not admit that they knew that one of their inmates was a prostitute. The Metropolitan Police had a duty to inspect these houses and could theoretically have caused problems for any that were effectively brothels. On the matter of whether or not Alice was a prostitute, McCormack, while admitting that the wretched woman was addicted to drink, denied that she was a prostitute in the ordinary acceptation of that term. This was a virtual admission from her partner that she was a casual prostitute. Dr. Phillips performed the post-mortem at 2 p.m. on the day of the murder in the mortuary, which was just around the corner there, and declared that the cause of death was from the severance of the left carotid artery via a 4-inch wound that would have been more or less instantaneous. She also suffered 2 stabs below this on the same side of the neck, but the windpipe was not severed. Dr. Phillips felt that the victim did not cry out due to shock. The cuts were made while Mackenzie was being held down on the ground, and there was no bruising to the back of the head such as would have occurred had she been attacked standing up and then fallen. There was also a relatively shallow 7-inch long jagged wound from the bottom of the left breast to the navel. This wound didn't open up either the abdominal cavity or the muscular structure. There was some bruising on the chest and 5 bruises or marks on the left side of the abdomen. Phillips suggested these marks were the imprint of the killer's right hand, with the left hand wielding the knife. There were also 7 or 8 scratches beginning from the navel and pointing down towards the genitalia, and a small cut across the mons veneris. Dr. Phillips believed she'd been dead for less than half an hour from when he first inspected the body. He also noticed that she was suffering from syphilis. Interestingly, Dr. Phillips also claimed to have found a clay pipe at the mortuary when one of his attendants stripped the body prior to his performing the post-mortem. He said this pipe broke into pieces when it hit the floor, but he'd collected them up, but they'd since gone missing. My presumption is that this was a second clay pipe. They were not expensive items. The Thames foreshore is littered with them, as I've illustrated before. Dr. Thomas Bond, the surgeon attached to Scotland Yard, inspected the body the next day and disagreed with Phillips's suggestion that the killer was left-handed, but they agreed that the wounds were caused by a sharp-pointed weapon. The neck wound was on the left side and the knife pulled forward, an almost impossible manoeuvre with the left hand. Bond also reported, "I think that in order to inflict the wound which I saw on the abdomen, the murderer must have raised the clothes with his left hand and inflicted the injuries with his right." The inquest opened at 5 p.m. on the very day of the murder, the 17th of July, and reconvened on the 19th of July and then the 14th of August 1889. It was presided over by the coroner, Win Edwin Baxter, at the Whitechapel Working Lads Institute on Whitechapel Road, a familiar location where most of the Jack the Ripper inquests had taken place. The first witness was McCormack. The coroner asked of him, "Did she tell you she was going to walk the streets?" McCormack replied, "She did not. She told me nothing." The coroner followed this up with, "Did you think she'd gone out looking for money?" Which elicited the incriminatingly non-committal response, "I can't say nothing about that." The implication as to what Alice was doing out that night was obvious. When asked by the coroner whether he had seen Alice about at night, another witness, PC George Neve, testified, "Between 10 and 11 o'clock. It was my opinion she was a prostitute." Reed said of Castle Alley, "I don't think a stranger would go down that alley unless he was taken. No stranger would think he could pass through it." The implication is that a stranger taken down there would only be taken by a prostitute. He went on with regard to Mackenzie, "Her clothing was in filthy condition, and I think she was one of the lowest type." Reed incidentally produced the pipe he had found and showed it in evidence to the jury. There was also speculation that the farthing might have been passed off to Mackenzie as a sixpence in the dark as her fee. It was noted that 2 farthings had been found at the Hanbury Street crime scene where Annie Chapman had been murdered the year before. Dr. Baxter Phillips testified that the culprit demonstrated a knowledge of how effectually to deprive a person of life, and that speedily. This surely means that the killer had killed before. In his summing up, Win Baxter said, "There is great similarity between this and the other class of cases which have happened in this neighbourhood, and if the same person has not committed this crime, it is clearly an imitation of the other cases." Inevitably, the verdict was willful murder against some person or persons unknown. The only suspect known by name to have been thoroughly investigated by the police was a man called William Wallace Brodie. On the 19th of July, he turned up at Leman Street Police Station and confessed to murdering Alice McKenzie and all the other Whitechapel victims while he was in a drunken stupor. He was regarded as being of unsound mind. Inquiries were made into his character, which was bad, and his location during the Whitechapel murders. It was found that he was in South Africa between the 6th of September 1888 and the 15th of July 1889, where he also confessed to being the Whitechapel murderer, and he had an alibi from his landlady for the night of Alice McKenzie's death. Brodie was released after about a week, but was rearrested for fraud. The press assumed that the Ripper had reappeared. The murder fiend is at his terribly ghastly work again. Of the doctors who examined the body, Baxter Phillips, who had played a major role in the previous year's Jack the Ripper investigations, didn't believe that Alice McKenzie was murdered by Jack the Ripper, writing, "After careful and long deliberation, I cannot satisfy myself on purely anatomical and professional grounds that the perpetrator of all the Whitechapel murders is our man." However, Thomas Bond disagreed, saying, "I see in this murder evidence of a similar design to the former Whitechapel murders, viz. Sudden onslaught on a prostrate woman, the throat skillfully and resolutely cut with subsequent mutilation, each mutilation indicating sexual thoughts and a desire to mutilate the abdomen and sexual organs. I am of opinion that the murder was performed by the same person who committed the former series of Whitechapel murders." Detective Inspector Frederick Aberline, who wasn't involved in the Alice McKenzie investigation, thought that the last victim of Jack the Ripper was Mary Kelly in November 1888. He believes from the evidence of his own eyesight that the Miller's Court atrocity was the last of the real series, the others having been imitations, and that in Miller's Court the murderer reached the culminating point of the gratification of his morbid ideas. But Detective Inspector Reed, who was involved, thought it was a Ripper case. There were 9 murders said to have been committed by Jack the Ripper, and he counted Alice McKenzie as being one of those 9. Robert Anderson head of the Criminal Investigation Branch at Scotland Yard, was away during the Alice McKenzie murder, but he wrote, "I am here assuming that the murder of Alice McKenzie on the 17th of July 1889 was by another hand. I was absent from London when it occurred, but the Chief Commissioner investigated the case on the spot and decided it was an ordinary murder and not the work of a sexual maniac." Actually, the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, James Munro, did not decide that it was an ordinary murder. He had written to the Home Office, "I need not say that every effort will be made by the police to discover the murderer, who I am inclined to believe is identical with the notorious Jack the Ripper of last year." Unlike most other senior policemen such as Anderson or McNaughton, Munro at least had some experience in that field prior to his appointment, having been in the colonial police in India. Incidentally, Anderson seems to have had a penchant for being on a holiday when these murders took place. He also missed the murders of Polly Nichols and Annie Chapman. The Assistant Chief Constable of the Criminal Investigation Department at Scotland Yard at the time, Melville McNaughton, wrote in 1894, "Alice McKenzie was found with her throat cut, or rather stabbed, in Castle Alley on the 17th of July 1889. No evidence was forthcoming and no arrest was made in connection with this case. The stab in the throat was of the same nature as in the case of the murder of Francis Coles in Swallow Gardens on the 13th of February 1891, for which Thomas Sadler, a fireman, was arrested and after several remands discharged. It was ascertained at the time that Sadler had sailed for the Baltic on the 19th of July 1889 and was in Whitechapel on the 9th of the 17th. He was a man of ungovernable temper and entirely addicted to drink and the company of the lowest prostitutes." This strongly implies that McNaughton believed that Sadler was responsible for both of these murders. In a historical sense, McNaughton's opinion on the number of Jack the Ripper victims prevailed. But was he correct? There's lots more fascinating information to come, so keep watching till the end, but don't forget to subscribe and share and like and comment and all these sorts of things as well. Alice McKenzie was murdered in the parish of Whitechapel on the 17th of July 1889, 8 months after the last of the so-called canonical victims of Jack the Ripper was killed, Mary Kelly, on the 9th of November 1888. But this didn't result in the police taking the murder any less seriously, as I've shown. She was attacked in the street with a knife. She had suffered abdominal mutilations and had been left on display. We have the same geographic location, the same general time frame, the same type of victim and the same murder weapon. I think the main objection to Alice McKenzie being a victim of Jack the Ripper is the superficiality of the wounds. There was a belief that with each Jack the Ripper victim there was an escalation in the severity of the attack. This was expressed by McNaughton, who wrote in 1894 that it will be noted that the fury of the mutilations increased in each case, and seemingly the appetite only became sharpened by indulgence. A much more rational theory is that the murderer's brain gave way altogether after his awful glut in Miller's Court. This views the series as an almost linear progression, with the wounds and fury of the attacker increasing until his brain gave out with the brutal murder of Mary Kelly. This sort of thinking has been quite pervasive ever since. However, the comparative lack of severity can be accounted for by the killer possibly being disturbed or finding the location too risky to linger too long. In the earlier quotation from McNaughton's memorandum, we saw that he highlighted the fact that with the murder of Alice McKenzie, the killer used his knife to stab rather than slash or rip. That also seems to be a key difference. However, we now know that serial killers are not automatons. They do not act in a uniform manner, with a linear escalation, for example. They often act in a random manner, with the severity of their attacks, the precise method of their attacks, varying. So stabbing as opposed to slashing is not necessarily significant. So these are not, I think, strong objections. In my opinion, the most glaring similarity between the generally accepted Jack the Ripper murders and that of Alice McKenzie is the sheer audacity of it. As we have seen, Castle Alley was patrolled regularly by the police and was on 2 beats. It was a cut-through that was used by the denizens of Whitechapel, such as Jacobs. There was a pub called the Three Crowns, about 50 yards from where the murder occurred, or 80 yards from where the murder occurred, that only shut at 12:30 a.m. It's rough, just past where those flashing lights are there. Rough sleepers were known to sleep in the carts and wagons that were regularly parked up there for the market trade. Several people lived in the washhouse, which was immediately next to the crime scene. The killer must have had his wits about him to commit the murder there and not be seen or heard by anyone. He must have been confident and familiar with his surroundings. He must have been practiced in what he did. The killer was taking a huge risk, which is extremely rare, but totally in accordance with how he conducted himself during the Autumn of Terror. I can't see how 2 different people behaving like that in that narrow time frame and that small geographical location could be possible. As blood was still flowing freely, even spurting according to Jacobs, when the body was discovered, it seems probable that Alice had literally only just been attacked. It seems likely to me that the culprit stealthily made his escape from the shadows in the direction of Whitechapel High Street when Andrews, who came down this way, momentarily left the body to get Jacobs, who was down that way. Contrary to popular opinion, random knife murders of this kind were extremely rare. Those that are also accompanied by abdominal mutilation and the body left on display are even rarer. So to me, it's almost certain that Alice McKenzie was killed by the same person who perpetrated the other murders. If Alice McKenzie was a victim of the serial killer known to history as Jack the Ripper, which of the suspects could fit the crime? Montague Druitt was dead. Francis Tumblety was in America. William Berry was dead. David Cohen was in a lunatic asylum. James Maybrick was dead. Advocates of those suspects are naturally going to be biased against any suggestion that Alice McKenzie was a victim of Jack the Ripper. George Chapman or Severin Klosowski, who went on to become a serial poisoner, was living at 126 Cable Street in St George in the East, where he also worked as a hairdresser. He married in October 1889. Chapman arrived in England from Poland between March 1887 at the earliest, or perhaps up to August 1888 at the latest. Either way, he was a newcomer and had initially lived in Limehouse. So how familiar would he have been with the Whitechapel High Street area? In November 1888, George Hutchinson was living at the Victoria Home, just around the corner from Castle Alley. This is sometimes advanced as a point in his favour as being a potential culprit for the Alice McKenzie murder. But unlike other common lodging houses, the Victoria Home had a strict door policy, and they kept registers of the comings and goings and operated a curfew at about 12:30. How would Hutchinson regain admittance unnoticed with the police specifically searching all the local lodging houses? I'll do episodes on Chapman and Hutchinson in the future. Jacob Levy was at large, living nearby in Middlesex Street. Just over a year later, he was confined to a lunatic asylum and was suffering from syphilis. Presumably, he was already showing signs of overt madness. The main proponents of the Levy theory don't actually believe that Alice McKenzie was a victim of Jack the Ripper. Aaron Kosminski was also at large, probably living with one of his siblings in St George in the East. In December 1889, he was arrested for walking a dog without a muzzle in the City of London. It's often suggested that this court appearance implies that he was lucid at this stage in his life. However, his testimony provoked laughter in the public gallery, and his brother had to appear to confirm his identity. Kosminski was first locked up in an asylum almost exactly a year after Alice McKenzie's murder, although he was briefly released again after this. His medical records from 1891 state that he had been suffering from his condition since 1885 and that he would have been unable to work for years. This would suggest that when Alice McKenzie was murdered, he was not fully lucid and independently able to act for himself. It seems very likely that both of these people were exhibiting clear signs of mental illness well before they were committed. Their families would have put up with their abhorrent behaviour for as long as possible and only committed them as a last resort. What of Charles Lechmere? He was still a carman, a cart delivery driver, presumably still employed by Pickfords at Broad Street Goods Station. Alice McKenzie was murdered at around 12:30 a.m. Contrary to what is often stated, we don't know what time Lechmere was due for work or whether his shift pattern was rigid. The only information we have is that on the morning of the 31st of August 1888, the day of Polly Nichols's murder, he claimed he left home at about 3:30 a.m, although by some accounts it was 3:20 a.m, and that he arrived at work at the Pickfords depot at 4 a.m. He also claimed he was late. Castle Alley linked Whitechapel High Street and Wentworth Street, two thoroughfares that run roughly parallel with each other and broadly east to west, or if you prefer, west to east. It's always been my presumption that the killer usually found his victims on the main roads and the victim then led their killer to a secluded spot to conduct their business, which tragically was where they were killed. It was also a suitably secluded spot for murder. The Aldgate High Street, Whitechapel Road axis was also broadly on Lechmere's route to work. It's my belief that when he was in the mood and looking for a victim, that he would target that busy axis and then make his escape down the much quieter Wentworth Street, Jack the Ripper's superhighway, the fastest route between Charles Lechmere's house in Doveton Street and his workplace at Broad Street Goods Station. Castle Alley was very close to two other Pickfords depots that Lechmere must have been familiar with. One was at White Swan Yard, adjacent to the White Swan pub at 20 Whitechapel High Street, just down there. This was directly opposite the entrance to Castle Alley. Interestingly, Martha Tabram was seen outside the White Swan on the night she was murdered. The other was at Hayden Square Goods Depot, which was immediately behind what is known as Butcher's Row on Aldgate High Street, a very short distance in this direction. It's interesting that Inspector Reed's father had worked for Pickfords, and Reed was actually born above a local Pickfords office in Canterbury in 1846. Is this one reason why Lechmere got a free pass during the Polly Nichols investigation, why the police failed to investigate him? Because Reed had fond memories of Pickfords and regarded their employees as being upstanding members of society? Perhaps. At about 1 p.m. on Wednesday the 24th of July 1889, Alice McKenzie's body was removed from the mortuary and taken to Tampines. Through streets packed to capacity with mourners and the curious, the body was conveyed in a hearse from the Tower Public House at 19 Artillery Place, which was where this building was here now. Tampines is just round the corner there. The hearse went down Hanbury Street, then down Baker's Row. Two black draped carriages followed the hearse, carrying the official mourners, who were people who knew Alice locally. None were from her family. There were even mutes sitting next to the drivers. It was all paid for by the landlord of the tower, I'm presuming that was one of Alice's locals, and the owner of Tenpennies. The crowds didn't thin until the cortege reached Whitechapel Road, which it crossed via Turner Street and then turned left down Commercial Road, where the horses broke into a trot, taking the group to the East London Cemetery in Plaistow just as it started to rain. Elizabeth Stride was buried at the same cemetery the year before. Thousands met the hearse, and the coffin of light brown wood was buried, I believe, in this area here, this raised area, or below this raised area, because the graves have been mounded up on top, in a common grave, and there's no marker for her to this day, unfortunately. So, was Alice McKenzie a victim of Jack the Ripper? And if so, which suspect do you think is most likely to have been responsible for her death? One thing is very clear. The way the police responded to this murder, with all the top brass turning up at the crime scene and the local police numbers being boosted for 2 months, shows beyond all doubt that in July 1889, the police did not think the case had been solved. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe for free and share and like to help the ever-changing YouTube algorithms, and comment below. What do you think?